The Boat That Returned. Chapter 1. Some mornings, the fjord keeps its secrets hidden beneath a blanket of mist. Other mornings, it quietly gives something back. The people of Embervik had learned long ago that there was little use in asking why. The sea had always followed its own rhythm, and so had the village. Long before the first window glowed with morning light, before the smell of fresh bread drifted from the bakery, before footsteps echoed along the quiet streets. One familiar figure was already walking toward Lantern Pier. The keeper carried the same old lantern, though it no longer needed to guide his way. Morning had already begun. The lantern simply belonged there, as naturally as the mountains belonged to the sky. He paused for a moment, listening. The gentle sound of water touching the wooden posts, a distant gull somewhere across the fjord, the whisper of wind moving through the pines above the shoreline. Everything was exactly as it had always been, almost. As he stepped onto the weathered boards of the pier, he noticed something resting quietly beside it. A small wooden rowing boat. Its paint had faded beneath years of sun, wind, and salt water. A single rope drifted lazily beside its bow. There were no oars, no fishing nets, no footprints on the damp wood, only the boat, waiting. The keeper stood quietly beside it. He did not seem surprised. In Embervik, people learned not to rush toward answers. He gently reached out, placing one hand against the side of the boat. The wood felt worn smooth, not abandoned, simply well-traveled. He smiled ever so slightly, almost as if greeting an old friend whose name had been forgotten, but whose face was somehow still familiar. The morning mist drifted slowly across the water. For several quiet minutes, nothing happened at all. And somehow, that made the moment feel even more important. Chapter 2. The story everyone remembered. The little rowing boat remained beside the pier, through breakfast, through the morning, and long after the mist had disappeared. No one hurried to claim it. No one questioned why it had arrived. In Embervik, people had learned that not every quiet mystery needed an immediate answer. Instead, they simply noticed. As the village slowly awakened, a few familiar faces wandered toward Lantern Pier. Some carried baskets, some walked their dogs. Others had simply come to greet the morning, as they always did. Each of them paused. Each of them looked at the boat, and almost every one of them smiled. Not because they had expected to see it, but because they remembered. An elderly fisherman rested one weathered hand against the worn wooden hull. He chuckled softly. "I never thought I'd see her again," he whispered. Nearby, a young girl looked up at her grandfather. "You know this boat?" The old man nodded. "Oh, yes. Everyone here does." He sat down at the edge of the pier, letting his boots dangle above the quiet water. "When I was your age," he began, "there wasn't a child in Embervik who hadn't sailed in this little boat. It carried fishing nets. It carried baskets of apples. It carried birthday cakes, Christmas trees, and once, 3 very stubborn sheep." The little girl laughed. "So, whose boat was it?" The old fisherman smiled. "That's the funny thing. It belonged to everyone." The keeper stood quietly nearby, listening. He had heard the story many times before, yet somehow it never sounded quite the same. The old fisherman continued. "It was built many years ago by a man named Elias. He believed a boat should spend more time on the water. than tied to a dock. So whenever someone needed it, they simply borrowed it. And when they were finished, they left it for the next person. The little girl frowned. But what if someone stole it? The old man looked across the still fjord. Then he smiled once more. In Embervik, no one ever did. For a little while, the three of them remained there, watching the water, watching the boat, listening to the quiet sounds that only peaceful mornings seem to remember. And although no one said it aloud, they all wondered the very same thing. Where had it been all these years? Chapter 3. Elias. The question lingered quietly throughout the village. Where had the little boat been? Some believed the currents had carried it away many years ago. Others thought it had drifted into one of the countless hidden coves beyond the northern cliffs. No one could say for certain, and somehow no one seemed troubled by not knowing. The old fisherman rested both hands upon his walking stick. "You know," he said softly. Elias never worried much about where his boat would end up. The little girl looked up. Who was Elias? The old man's eyes wandered across the fjord, as though searching for someone who had left many years ago, yet never truly disappeared. He was a builder, but not of large things. He repaired broken fences. He carved walking sticks. He mended chairs, patched roofs, and every spring, he quietly repainted this little boat. The keeper smiled. He remembered the smell of fresh pine tar drifting across the pier. He remembered watching Elias sit exactly where the boat rested now, never rushing, never complaining, simply working, as though careful hands were their own kind of conversation. The old fisherman chuckled. Elias used to say, "If you take good care of small things, they often take good care of you." The little girl traced one finger along the weathered side of the boat. "The paint is almost gone." "Yes." The old man nodded. "But look closer." She leaned forward. Beneath the faded blue paint, tiny carved marks could still be seen inside the wooden rail. Small initials, small dates, little memories, each one no larger than a thumbnail. The old fisherman smiled. Every child who learned to row was allowed to carve their initials, not to claim the boat, but to remember the day. The keeper quietly ran his fingers across the worn carvings. There were dozens, perhaps hundreds, some almost impossible to read now. Time had softened them, just as the sea had softened the wood, but they were still there, patiently waiting, just like the stories they carried. Far across the still water, a single ray of sunlight finally broke through the clouds. It rested gently upon the little boat. For a brief moment, the faded blue paint almost seemed new again. No one spoke. There are moments when silence feels far more respectful than words. Chapter 4. The First Journey. By afternoon, the little boat had become the quiet center of the village, not because it demanded attention, but because memories have a gentle way of gathering people together. Someone brought fresh rope. Another found 2 old wooden oars stored inside a nearby boathouse. A carpenter carefully tightened a loose plank. An elderly woman arrived carrying a small tin of blue paint. She smiled softly. "I thought someone might need this." No one had asked her to bring it. She had simply known. The keeper worked alongside the others without saying very much. His hands moved slowly, comfortably, as though they had repaired this very boat many times before. Perhaps they had. The little girl watched every careful movement. She handed over nails, held brushes, passed tools from one pair of weathered hands to another. Without realizing it, she had become part of the story herself. As the afternoon sun settled lower above the mountains, the boat looked different, not new. It wasn't supposed to. The faded paint remained. The scratches remained. The carved initials remained. Only the things that needed care had been cared for. Nothing more, nothing less. The old fisherman nodded with quiet satisfaction. Elias would have liked that. The keeper untied the rope. The little boat drifted only a few inches from the pier, almost as if it had taken its first breath. The young girl looked up. "Can we take her out?" The old fisherman laughed. "I believe. That's exactly what boats are for." Together, the three of them climbed aboard. The keeper pushed gently against the pier. The boat slipped quietly onto the still fjord. The water welcomed it, without a single splash. For several moments, no one spoke. The only sound was the slow rhythm of wooden oars, finding water once again. Above them, the mountains stood exactly where they always had. The lantern remained behind on the pier, small now, almost distant. Yet somehow, its quiet light could still be seen, even in daylight. The little girl smiled. "I think she remembers the way." The keeper looked across the calm water, then back toward Lantern Pier, and for the first time that day, he allowed himself to believe. Perhaps the boat had never truly been lost. Perhaps it had simply been waiting for someone to need it again. Chapter 5. The journey continues. Morning arrived quietly once again. The mountains wore the same soft colors they had worn the day before. The fjord remained perfectly still. Mist drifted lazily above the water, as though the world itself had not quite awakened. The keeper followed his familiar path toward Lantern Pier. The lantern still burned softly beside the weathered railing, just as it always had. He smiled. Then his eyes wandered toward the place where the little rowing boat had rested the evening before. The rope was gone. The boat was gone. Only gentle ripples touched the wooden posts. Nothing more, nothing less. The keeper stood for a while, looking out across the quiet fjord. He did not search. He did not call out. He simply watched the water, as though greeting an old friend setting off on another journey. A few moments later, the little girl hurried down the path. She stopped beside him. "It's gone," she whispered. The keeper nodded. "Yes." She looked out across the fjord. "Do you think someone took it?" For a long moment, he said nothing. The morning breeze carried the scent of pine and fresh water. Finally, he smiled. "I hope so." The little girl looked surprised. "You do?" He nodded once more. A boat isn't meant to spend its life tied to a pier. It's meant to carry people and memories. She thought about his words, then looked back toward the empty water. So, someone needed it. The keeper rested one hand upon the lantern's wooden post. "I think someone probably did." The little girl smiled. Somehow, that answer felt exactly right. She picked up a small pebble and gently tossed it into the fjord. The tiny circles spread across the calm water, growing wider until they quietly disappeared. The keeper watched them fade. Kindness, he thought, often travels the very same way. One small gesture, reaching places we never get to see. Far beyond the mouth of the fjord, Perhaps another child was laughing inside the little blue boat. Perhaps someone was carrying fresh bread home. Perhaps an old fisherman was finding one last peaceful morning on the water. No one in Embervik would ever know. And somehow, they didn't need to, because some gifts are meant to keep traveling, not to return to us, but to continue helping others, wherever the current may carry them. Chapter 6. The water always knows the way. Evening settled gently over Embervik. The last golden light faded behind the mountains, leaving the fjord wrapped in quiet shades of blue. One by one, warm lights appeared inside the cottages along the shoreline. The smell of burning birch drifted softly through the cool evening air. Somewhere in the village, someone closed a wooden gate, far away. A dog barked once, then silence returned. The keeper made his familiar walk toward Lantern Pier. The lantern rested exactly where it always had, waiting. He struck the flint, a tiny spark, a quiet flame. The warm light slowly filled the old glass lantern, spilling softly across the weathered wooden boards beneath his feet. He stood for a while, watching its gentle reflection dance upon the still water. There was no little blue boat tied beside the pier, only empty water and endless sky. Yet somehow, the pier did not feel empty at all. The keeper rested one hand upon the lantern, just as he had done countless evenings before. He looked out across the fjord. Somewhere beyond the distant islands, someone might be rowing home beneath the same evening sky. Someone might be carrying bread, flowers, firewood, or simply enjoying the quiet company of the water. Perhaps a child was learning to row for the very first time. Perhaps an old fisherman was smiling at familiar mountains. Perhaps someone who had never heard of Embervik was discovering that little blue boat for the very first time. The keeper smiled, not because he needed to know, but because he didn't. Some stories were never meant to belong to only one village, like kindness. They quietly travelled onward, leaving something gentle behind wherever they arrived. The evening grew darker. The first stars appeared above the mountains. Their reflections shimmered across the calm fjord, joining the lantern's warm light upon the water. The keeper remained there for just a little while longer, listening to the wind, to the water, to the silence between them. Then, almost too quietly to hear, he whispered, "Safe travels." Not to anyone in particular, perhaps to the little boat, perhaps to whoever needed it next, or perhaps to every traveller who had ever found comfort beside a quiet shore. He turned toward the village. The lantern continued to glow behind him, steady, patient, faithful, just as it always had. And somewhere, far beyond the mountains, a little blue boat continued its journey, carrying with it not only the hands that had built it, but every hand that had cared for it since. Because the finest things we leave behind are rarely the things we keep. They are the things we quietly pass on. Thank you for spending another peaceful evening here in Embervik. Until next time, may calm waters find you too. Good night.